Security walked me out of the building I'd worked in for 32 years carrying a cardboard box with a stapler, a coffee mug, and 3 framed photos of kids who were now grown. And the whole procedure took less than 20 minutes, start to finish, for a career that had taken 32 years to build. I remember standing in the parking lot afterward, box balanced against one hip, genuinely unsure for a full minute which direction my own car was parked in. A small, almost comic disorientation that felt, in hindsight, like an accurate preview of the larger disorientation waiting for me over the following 8 months. I want to tell you what happened after that box got loaded into my car. The 8 months of half-hearted job searching that followed, and the specific conversation with a bartender on a small island in the Caribbean who taught me more about actually starting over than any career counselor or severance package ever did. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real version of these stories every week, not the polished one. My name is Kenneth Brooks. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 32 years working for the same industrial equipment distributor, starting as a warehouse coordinator at 27 and working my way up to regional sales director by my late 40s, a title I held for the final 13 years of my career. I remember specifically the day I got promoted into that director role, standing in my new office looking out over a parking lot I'd walked across as a warehouse coordinator for over a decade, genuinely believing, in that specific moment, that I'd arrived somewhere permanent, that the climbing itself was finished, and the remaining years would simply be about steady, comfortable maintenance of what I'd built. I want to be honest about how much of my identity that title carried. I didn't just work for that company, I organized my entire self-understanding around it. The specific weight of a business card, the way strangers at parties nodded differently once you mentioned managing a 6-state territory, the quiet pride of a corner office I genuinely earned over 3 decades of steady, unglamorous effort. A pride I never once thought to examine too closely, while I still had the office to feel it in. The company got acquired by a larger competitor 2 years before I could have retired with full vested benefits, and within 4 months of that acquisition closing, an entire layer of regional management, mine included, was eliminated in what the announcement email called a restructuring, designed to eliminate redundancy. I found out I still had a job that morning, and didn't have one by lunch. Called into a conference room with an HR representative I'd never met and a termination letter already printed, my direct manager conspicuously absent from a meeting that was, in every meaningful sense, about me. The HR representative used the word transition 4 separate times in a meeting that lasted 14 minutes, and I remember counting. Silently, the specific way you count something meaningless when your brain is refusing to process the actual content of what's happening to you. The same way I once counted ceiling tiles as a nervous 27-year-old waiting for my very first performance review with that same company decades earlier. The 8 months after that layoff were, in their own quiet way, harder than the layoff itself. I updated my resume, applied to positions I was genuinely qualified for, and discovered repeatedly the specific brutal math of being 60 years old in a job market that claims not to discriminate by age, while somehow never quite explaining why a man with 32 years of proven experience kept losing out to candidates 20 years younger, for roles I could have done in my sleep. I got 2 actual interviews out of roughly 60 applications, both polite, both ultimately unsuccessful, both leaving me with the specific corrosive suspicion that my age itself, not my qualifications, had quietly disqualified me before I'd even walked in the door. I started, somewhere around month 5, deliberately omitting graduation dates from my resume, a small act of quiet self-erasure that I recognized even at the time as a genuinely depressing thing to be doing at 60 years old after an entire career of never once needing to hide anything about myself professionally. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, how many of you have experienced something similar late in a career? The specific humiliation of being reduced to a line item on a spreadsheet after decades of genuine contribution. Because I think that particular experience carries a distinct weight that people who haven't lived through it consistently underestimate. My severance and savings meant I wasn't in immediate financial danger, which I want to acknowledge honestly, because it gave me a kind of latitude a lot of people in my exact situation don't have. My wife, Diane, watched me spend those 8 months increasingly listless, applying to fewer jobs each month, spending more afternoons doing genuinely nothing in particular, staring at a laptop screen for hours without actually typing anything, and she finally suggested, gently but firmly, over dinner one night in month 7, that I take an actual break rather than continuing to grind through a job search that was clearly draining something in me faster than it was producing results. I resisted the idea initially, telling her that stepping away felt like admitting defeat, that a 32-year career didn't just pause itself for a vacation while the search continued. The same stubborn instinct that had kept me climbing that same corporate ladder for over 3 decades without ever once seriously questioning whether the climbing itself still made sense, and she told me, plainly, that watching me disappear a little more each week wasn't actually the discipline I thought it was. It was just quiet suffering dressed up as work ethic. We booked 3 weeks on Isla Mujeres, a small island off Cancun, intending it purely as a reset before I resumed the search with fresh energy, neither of us imagining at the time that the trip would end up reshaping the goal itself rather than simply refreshing my energy for pursuing the original one, which in hindsight feels almost too tidy a twist to have actually happened to us. I found the bar my second evening there, a small open-air place a few blocks back from the main tourist strip, quieter than the beach clubs, the kind of place where the same handful of locals and long-term snowbirds occupied the same stools most evenings, run by a bartender named Nacho, who I'd later learn had his own considerably more deliberate version of exactly the reinvention I was accidentally stumbling into. I sat at that bar most evenings that first week, nursing a beer, watching Diane read on the beach earlier in the day and joining me there most nights, and Nacho, without ever prying exactly, had a specific gift for drawing out more of my actual situation than I'd told most of my own friends back home. The particular skill of a man who'd clearly spent years learning to ask exactly the right small question at exactly the right unhurried moment. Nacho, it turned out, had practiced law in Mexico City for 11 years, before walking away from it entirely in his late 30s, a decision he described to me over the course of several separate conversations, never all at once, the way real stories actually get told rather than delivered in a single tidy monologue. He'd been a genuinely successful corporate attorney, the kind of career his own family had sacrificed considerably to help him build, his mother having worked 2 jobs through his entire law school education, a debt of gratitude he told me he'd carried like a second briefcase for over a decade. Somewhere around year 9, he told me, He'd started experiencing the specific dread most Sunday evenings that comes from spending 5 days a week doing work that technically succeeded by every external measure, while feeling almost entirely disconnected from anything he'd have called meaning. A dread he'd initially dismissed as ordinary burnout, before slowly recognizing it as something considerably more fundamental. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make Nacho's story sound like some simple parable about corporate law being empty and bartending being pure, because that's not actually what he told me, and it's not what I came to believe either. What he told me, specifically, one slow Tuesday night, about 10 days into my stay, both of us the only people left at the bar past midnight, was that the actual problem hadn't been the law itself. It had been that he'd built his entire identity around a job title, the same exact way I'd apparently built mine. So completely that he could no longer distinguish between the question, "What do I do?" and the much harder, much more important question, "Who am I?" And that those two questions had quietly become the same question in his head for the better part of a decade before he finally noticed the difference. He described it at one point as spending years fluent in a language that turned out to only ever describe half of who he actually was, the professional half, while the rest of him had gone quietly, steadily undernourished the entire time without his noticing. He asked me directly, that same Tuesday, what I actually missed about my old job, and I found myself struggling for a genuine answer beyond the title itself, the org chart position, the specific status of managing 6 states' worth of territory. I tried a few times to name something concrete, a specific deal I'd closed, a specific team I'd built, and each time, sitting there with Nacho waiting patiently, I found the answer collapsing back into the same shape, the title, the status, the corner office, rather than any actual task or relationship I could point to with genuine feeling attached. When I finally admitted, out loud, for the first time since the layoff, that I genuinely couldn't name a single task from that job I actually missed doing, only the identity the job had given me, Nacho nodded like a man who'd heard that exact confession more times than I probably wanted to know, from more customers than just me. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, if you were laid off or retired from your career tomorrow, could you actually name the specific work you'd miss, or only the title and status attached to it? Because I think that distinction matters enormously, and most of us never actually examine it until we're forced to. The same way I never once examined it across 32 comfortable years of assuming the question simply didn't apply to me. Nacho told me, over the following 2 weeks, about the specific process of rebuilding his own sense of self after leaving law. How he'd spent nearly a year doing genuinely nothing structured at all before slowly discovering that he loved the specific, immediate satisfaction of bartending. The visible, same-night proof that you'd made someone's evening better. Something 11 years of corporate law had rarely offered him in any form he could actually feel. He described his early bartending shifts working for someone else on the mainland before eventually opening this small place himself, as the first time in over a decade he'd finished a workday able to point to something specific, a good conversation, a well-mixed drink, a stranger who'd left happier than they'd arrived, rather than an abstract quarterly metric that never quite translated into anything he could actually feel in his own body. A specific physical kind of satisfaction he told me he hadn't even known he'd been missing until he finally experienced it firsthand. He wasn't suggesting I become a bartender myself, And I want to be clear about that, because the actual lesson was never about the specific job. It was about the underlying question. What did I actually want to build now? Separate entirely from what Ursum or an org chart said I should want. By my final week on the island, I'd started, almost without meaning to, sketching out an idea I'd been quietly circling for years without ever taking it seriously. A small consulting practice specifically helping mid-sized companies navigate the exact kind of ownership transitions and acquisitions that had ended my own career. Using 32 years of genuine operational knowledge that a corporate org chart had never fully valued, but that plenty of smaller companies going through exactly what mine had gone through genuinely needed. I'd actually had 2 former colleagues mention, over the years, that I had a real talent for walking nervous smaller businesses through exactly this kind of transition. Comments I'd always treated as pleasant compliments rather than as an actual signal worth pursuing. I mentioned the idea to Nacho on my last night at the bar, half embarrassed, sketching the rough shape of it on a cocktail napkin the way I imagined plenty of his customers had done before me, and he told me, simply, that it sounded like the first thing I'd described in 2 weeks of conversation that I actually wanted, rather than the thing I thought I was supposed to want. A distinction he said he'd learned to listen for specifically in the particular way a person's voice changes when they're describing it. Diane and I flew home, and instead of resuming the same defeated job search, I spent the following 4 months building that consulting practice properly, registering the business formally, reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts, using contacts from 32 years in the industry rather than a Rusum stripped of graduation dates to open those first conversations. The early months were slow, genuinely slow, closer in spirit to starting a career at 27 than continuing one at 61, unreturned emails and small, unglamorous first projects that paid a fraction of what I'd once billed my old employer for a single afternoon's work, and there were several weeks I found myself quietly questioning whether Nacho's cocktail napkin encouragement had been more romantic than realistic. But I now work with 3 regular mid-sized clients, considerably less income than my old regional director salary, a fact I've had to make real peace with rather than simply pretend doesn't matter, but work I genuinely chose rather than work that was simply handed to me by a title I'd spent decades climbing toward. We returned to Isla Mujeres 6 months later, a genuine celebration trip rather than an escape this time, and I found Nacho at the same bar, same stool territory, same unhurried rhythm to his evening. I told him how the consulting practice had actually taken shape, walked him through the 3 clients, the slow early months, the specific moment 4 months in when the first client actually referred a second one purely on the strength of the work itself. He poured us both a drink, on the house, which I later learned from another regular was a genuine rarity for him, and told me, in the same unhurried way he'd told me his own story months earlier, that this was exactly the kind of return visit that made bartending worth doing. Watching someone actually build the second half of their own answer rather than simply talking about wanting to. I think about that cardboard box often, the stapler and the mug and the 3 photos, carried out of a building in under 20 minutes after 32 years, and I've come to understand it differently than I did that first devastating afternoon. It wasn't the ending of my identity. It was simply the ending of a job title I'd mistaken for one. A distinction a bartender on a small Caribbean island taught me more clearly, over a handful of unhurried evening conversations. than 8 months of increasingly desperate job applications ever managed to. Diane keeps a photo from that second trip on the refrigerator, Nacho and me behind the bar, both of us laughing at something neither of us can fully remember now, and I catch myself looking at it some mornings while I make coffee before starting whatever that day's consulting work actually holds. A small daily reminder of exactly how close I came to spending the rest of my working life quietly grieving a title instead of actually building something new. I don't miss the corner office the way I once assumed I permanently would, and I've stopped expecting to. A specific relief I genuinely didn't anticipate feeling this early into the whole process. What I've kept instead, the thing that's actually proven durable across this entire strange unplanned reinvention, is the specific question Nacho handed me that slow Tuesday night. The one I now ask myself regularly whenever a new client engagement or a new possibility presents itself, whether I actually want the thing in front of me or whether I'm simply reaching for it because 32 years of. Habit told me wanting things like that was the whole point. Most days now, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, I actually know the difference. I'm Kenneth Brooks. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.